Let's get started actually, and people will come. I know that some people are coming down from upstairs and some are coming in from outside. But let me just say that I'm really excited about this panel. This conference has been largely around the immediate commercial prospects of robotics, and we've talked a lot about the legal hurdles and where the industry is going. And it's been, even had practitioners giving sort of very concrete advice around what startups and so forth can be doing. But none of that is to deny in any way that in order to commercialize robotics, in order for robotics to go forward, we also need to deal with the ethical and design challenges. And so to me, this panel is about addressing some of these factors that are, some of which are grounded in the law, of course, but also have a sort of normative overlay and are about the acceptability of robots amongst us. And so I'm very excited to have the discussion being led, obviously, by Ian Kerr, who, along with Judge Carno, obviously, and Larry Solon, we talked about, is like one of the people that I read. I mean, when I got into this, I looked around and I was like, this is fascinating. Who's doing robot law? And like, it was just Ian Kerr. It was like the person that was doing it, and so I read all of his stuff. And so, to be a collaborator with you over the years has been really wonderful. And so, I thank you for taking on this as well. And then we obviously have folks who are, graduate students, I think, for the most part, working in two different areas. Some of whom are doing amazing work. A little north of me in Vancouver, under Michael, under Professor Vanderloos's tutelage, and are some of the. And this lab is I think one of the thought leaders, and is no exaggeration to say one of the international thought leaders on roboethics. And so the work you have is very, very exciting. And then Aneta is coming to us by way of Europe and has looked at privacy issues in a variety of contexts and has really sort of interesting ideas about how to apply them to robotics. So with that short introduction, I wanted to turn it over to Ian with my thanks again.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Let me first say thank you to you for all of your efforts in organizing this event. It's a wonderful event. There's so many of us that just get excited the whole year before we come here to come. And, one thing that hasn't been really noted is that not only has Ryan been doing all of the heavy lifting, but in a sense he's been doing it through a kind of telepresence. Where some of the operatives involved in that telepresence involve a lot of goodwill that he built up over his years at Stanford, where I know the people who are here really enjoy working with him. And so we're grateful to be here in Paradise. It's very hard to lead a panel looking outside at the palm trees, but we're going to have a great panel. I'm very excited about it. On the subject of designing values, right? The panel could have been called Designing Robots, but that's not really it. And although Ryan mentioned the idea that some of the important aspects in thinking about designing robots involve a normative, I think you used the word normative overlay a moment ago, if I heard you right, Ryan. I think in some ways we're also going to be talking about the normative underlay and the underpinnings in all of this. So in thinking about this panel and the topic of designing values, I couldn't resist the temptation to start with a fairly long passage that I want to quote from one of my favorite authors who was writing about this long before we were thinking about instantiating these ideas into robots per se. And that is the sort of social critic of technology, a political thinker, Langdon Winner, who once wrote a famous piece that some people in the room will know, Do Artifacts Have Politics? And in that piece, he was questioning this idea of the relationship between things, these products, these artifacts that we as humans create, and some of the value choices and the underlying politics within. And so I'm going to start with a quote before we get into the panel from Langdon Winner's do artifacts have politics? And here's what he said. He said, within a given category of technological change, there are, roughly speaking, two kinds of choices that can affect the relative distribution of power, authority, and privilege in a community. Often, the crucial decision is a simple yes or no, a simple yes or no choice. Are we going to develop and adopt the thing or not? In recent years, and he was writing this in the 70s, in recent years, many local, national, and international disputes about technology have centered on yes or no judgments about such things as food additives, pesticides, the building of highways, nuclear reactors, dam projects, and proposed high-tech weapons. The fundamental choices about an anti-ballistic missile or supersonic transport, or I might add in this day and age, lethal autonomous robots, is whether or not the thing is going to join our society as a piece of its operating equipment. Reasons given for and against are frequently as important as those concerned with the adoption of an important new law. So his recognition here was, at least in part, that the decision about whether to adopt and deploy a technology was like a decision about whether or not to adopt or employ a new set of laws. And so we see some of the linkages that we've been talking about for the last day and a half already present. But he goes on to say, and this is the last paragraph of the quote, a second range of choices, equally critical in many instances, has to do with specific features in the design or arrangement of a technical system after the decision to go ahead with it has already been made. Even after a utility company wins permission to build a large electric power line, important controversies can remain with respect to the placement of its routes and the design of its towers. Even after an organization has decided to institute a system of computers, controversies can still arise with regards to the kinds of components, the programs, modes of access, and other specific features that the system will include. Some of the most interesting research on technology and politics at present focuses upon the attempt to demonstrate in a detailed, concrete fashion how seemingly innocuous design features actually mask social choices of profound significance. And so I think, to me, in many ways, Langdon Winner sets the tone for, I think, at least some of the inquiry that's been going on in the last few years, both from the perspective of people who are engaged in robotics and building robots, but also for people who are engaged in law and thinking about how we might design some of the legal features into these machines so that they accord with a certain set of values and standards that we think are important in law. And so when it comes to making policy choices in the world of robotics, it likewise seems that there are two very different kinds of choices. The first kind that Langdon Winner described are the choices about yes or no propositions. Should we be even engaging in the deployment of this type of technology? But the second choice is one which presumes that we ought to adopt the technology and focuses instead on issues of design, and that's what this panel is about. It's about thinking about design questions, but I would suggest it's also about thinking about when to link the design questions back to the threshold questions of the sort that Langdon Winner talks about. So we have the more modest aim here of talking about design issues, but I think it will raise the larger issues as well. And so I'd just like to quickly welcome Ergun and AJung and Aneta to the panel, and also their supervisor, Ergun and AJung supervisor Mike, who's here as well, and who is also an author on the paper, who hopefully will have a chance to integrate into the discussion as well at some point. So I want to start off just by, this panel is one which was accompanied with two papers that were given in advance for the audience to read. But knowing that sometimes not everybody has read all of the papers, I thought we'd talk about them. But before we even launch into a brief discussion of the first paper, AJung, I wanted to ask you that in order to situate the paper that Ergun's about to present on your colleague's behalf, could you tell us just a little bit about the Open Roboethics Initiative, which I think is foundational to the kind of work you're trying to do?
Yeah, so Open Roboethics Initiative, we call it ORI for short, just because it catchier that way. It's an idea that we proposed last year at Robot, and I'm very happy to be back at Robot 2012 talking about this idea again. So it's basically the idea that was spawned off of the successes of open source robotics or software that's out there, and openness in discussions that has been happening online, and how successful that has been. So Leila Takayama from before lunch, the roundtable, she actually talked a lot about the powers of open source, and that makes my job really easy. So if you can imagine, her proposal. Her discussion was about how open source accelerates the robotics development. But my proposition of Ori was that if we can have a discussion online and integrate the interdisciplinary knowledge that's out there in the world into one centralized web space, and have designers involved in that discussion as well, then maybe we can have a better advancement of robo-ethics or robot ethics. So that, in essence, our idea is to incorporate what kind of discussions we are having about robotics technology, including some of the stuff that we've been talking about today and yesterday, the legal, societal, and ethical implications of the technology, and make that really available to people who care about it, the stakeholders of the technology, including designers who I believe are really interested in answering questions like, who is responsible when things go wrong? How should my design be affected by the answers of that question? And I think a lot of the questions that we raise in roboethics as a field has a lot to do with our cultural background, as well as your religious beliefs, and a lot of stuff like that. And it's really hard to incorporate all of our values or all of our moral systems into one unifying system, because human ethics itself is a very controversial area. We don't really have an agreement or consensus on which ethical theory or moral theory is the right one and the most comprehensive. So without having that kind of consensus, can we actually still inform robot design so that we have our values implemented into the products that's going to be in our homes in the near future, hopefully?
Okay. I wanted to follow up, just when you were speaking, one of the things that occurred to me in terms of your own approach, which is an open, consultative approach to building the design values into the robots. I wondered if, I don't know if you had ever contemplated some of the ideas, for example, the famous quote by Joe Weizenbaum, who was an early thinker in artificial intelligence, he famously once said, "The computer programmer is a creator of universes for which she alone is responsible. Universes of virtually unlimited complexity can be created in the form of computer programs." And I think one of the things that he was trying to say in his work, Computer Power and Human Reason, is to recognize that the programmer should see limits within themselves in terms of the way they express that power in the universes that they create. And it seems very interesting that the approach that you're taking is one that takes on a kind of humility in response to that kind of quote. I wonder if you had been thinking about those things in terms of a response to the kind of power that comes with being able to create robots.
Yeah, I mean, I actually discussed my personal history of why I'm in this field of roboethics back in Miami, Robot. But as an undergrad student in engineering or mechatronic systems in particular, you get to learn about how to put these these technical knowledge together to build something really cool. And part of the choices that we make of going into that kind of program is that we have fun using these technological systems to do cool stuff. But at the same time, while I was learning how to put sensors and actuators and computing systems together to do a particular task, that made me realize that with knowledge there's greater power, and then with greater power there's greater responsibility. So that made me really conscious of, okay, what are the kind of things that I could build, and how does that relate to my moral stance on what kind of things should be built and how it should be built. So I think that relates to what I'm trying to do. with my colleagues. Yeah.
That's great. I'm hoping that I stand right at the generation that bridges the gap between Joe Weizenbaum and Spider-Man in terms of the way we think about that. But that's that's a useful starting point. So Ergun, I'm going to turn to you, and I want you to tell us a little bit about your paper and your use of the MailBot. And when I say MailBot, for those who haven't read the paper, that's M-A-I-L. In particular, I'm hoping that part of what you'll be able to tell us about is your approach to what I think I would have described as crowdsourcing values in terms of how to program the robot.
Yes, that's right. Okay, so to start it simple, like we saw in the previous panel, the PR2 robot from Velov Garage, we saw that they deal with lots of technical challenges, SLAM or image processing, voice recognition, all these kind of technical challenges. But when the technology grows, now we got to a point where the human-robot interaction is also important. And this is my personal opinion. I believe that with those technical challenges, these social challenges that we need to find, what are the values that we need to implement, we have to come up with some certain ways to implement these values on the robot. But then if we implement only my thoughts on the robot, then it would be only like an Ergun robot. But then people who are interacting with this robot have different values, different norms. They come from different cultures, different genders. So when we think about all these different parameters, then it's so hard to generalize these values. So there are lots of law people here. So even though it's so hard to implement a speeding ticket robot, we talked about it yesterday, now we are dealing with something that is not written, the social norms. So what we did is to demonstrate how we can implement some socially acceptable behaviors to these robots. Last year at UBC, some grad students ran a hackathon. So we sat down and programmed the robot, the PR2 robot, to ride the elevator autonomously. So we clicked enter, and then the robot starts navigating within the lab, find the elevator, look for the button, and ride the elevator itself. But that was a pure technical challenge for us. But now what we did for this paper is we bring the HRI portion. So what if someone is actually riding the elevator when the robot wants to ride it? Or what if someone is waiting outside the elevator? So what kind of interaction should the robot do in order to ride the elevator itself? Because right now, due to technical limitations, they cannot ride it together. So this paper is specifically on the HRI portion. So, of course, we cannot come up with a general solution. Okay, we will implement these values, and that will solve all the issues. But what we did, to simplify, we picked a very simple scenario. We picked some certain factors that we thought are important, which are, okay, so what is the urgency of the task? Does the robot is in a hurry, or is it just a random task that it needs to complete? That was one thing. The second one is what the environment looked like. So is there the person inside the elevator, outside the elevator, and also the state of the person. That as an engineer I call state, but so is he carrying a heavy object, or is he in a wheelchair? Or is it like a healthy adult just taking the elevator just like us? And also the urgency of the human as well. So we brought everything together, and then we came up with a scenario. And the scenario is, let's say in an office environment, you need to deliver a piece of mail to the president's office, and it's robot's task to do it. And it needs to ride the elevator, and there will be people in and outside the elevator. So we come up with these different scenarios, and then we prepare the survey question near, and then we ask people, like crowdsourcing. That was a very simple, small group of people, the current ORI members, and then we ask them to rate the different actions. So, okay, we come up with 4 actions: yielding action, so the robot yields to the person, or not yield, to the person, so it rides the elevator or engage in a dialogue with the robot, or doing no action. So we ask these questions, and then we let people to rate their appropriate behaviors. And then based on these results, we implemented these behaviors to the robot so that we can come up with some socially acceptable behaviors under different conditions so that robot can perform those different behaviors. So this is different than the top-down approach. So you can, or instead of doing this, you can just come up with different scenarios based on your needs for the robot and implement your own values or your own appropriate behaviors to the robot, and don't really care about what the society thinks or the end user thinks. So, but in this, with comparing this to the ORI, we it's not really crowdsourcing exactly, but it's bringing all the stakeholders together to design the new generation of the behaviors for the robots. I really want to mention Peter Kahn's research. So he's a psychology professor in University of Washington, and he says these robots are new, an ontological category. And now we have a privilege to actually come up with the behaviors, the characteristics for these robots, so that we can create the new species based on our needs, and we can apply them the good values or the bad ones. So I would like to show you the video that we have to demonstrate what we did. Actions robots taking. First four behaviors, and the last four that you'll see.
The next one.
Non-urgent mail, and there will
I have an urgent mail to deliver and need to ride the elevator. Please exit the elevator.
So this is one of the basic that we saw.
I will write the next one. I need to ride the elevator to do my delivery task. Are you in a hurry? Go ahead. I will write the next one. elevator. Please do not enter the elevator.
So it's running, it's delivering a non-urgent mail, but it's kind of cheating, that's why. So of course, this is not limited only the elevator, but still a very simple scenario. There were lots of different actions that we might implement, but we only to simplify things. We only picked 4, and then this is the result that we.
I wanted to ask you about that in particular. I mean, I was in reading your paper, and I was sent sort of a beta version of the video to take a peek at as well. And thinking that through, I couldn't help but be reminded in my own mind of this amazing scene some of you will remember from the movie version of iRobot. That movie having about as much to do with Asimov's iRobot as the Roomba. But in any event, there's this fascinating scene, I don't know if you've seen it or recall it, but of just the robotic society as imagined in the film. And so there's a robot walking up the street with 4 dogs. He's a robot dog walker. And then there's some other robots who are, are working for the city, doing the trash route into the machines and all that. And I'm sort of thinking, and it's a complex scene with all these different interactions going on. And I was wondering, in sort of thinking that through and thinking about the laborious task of coding an elevator robot to know when to get in or not get into the elevator, and you imagine the complexity of this truly co-robotic society, does that sort of paralyze you with fear of the idea of carrying this project out sort of universally, or is it something that you just see that as we start to do this, we'll be coding these in the same way that we code other things and we'll get it done? I'm wondering if you've ever thought about that.
Yeah, so what we think is this is just a baby step towards more unexplored area. What we really want to do with this paper and with this work actually is to start people thinking about these kind of different challenges and starting to get more people into this kind of development, and then so that, just like you said, like programming, this will grow, and if we can somehow coordinate all these different behaviors, different scenarios, then we might be able to get it done easily. But it's not going to happen in one day, as we talked about it before.
Right. Yeah. So in thinking a little bit more about the project itself, and I'll ask this question to both AJung and Ergun. One of the things that you clearly see that's striking about it, it's a bottom-up approach, and it's an approach which goes out there and sources the values from what you described as a community of stakeholders openly. And, I have a few questions around that in terms of, first of all, your intention with that choice as a design element. And then also, sort of relatedly, about how you would go about interpreting, if that's the right phrase, that's a phrase lawyers might use to, or scientists, I suppose, would think about interpreting the data in terms of what comes in. Because certainly as somebody who thinks a lot about applied philosophy and ethics, we don't always assign appropriate or permissible ethical values to the majority voice in a stakeholder thing. So I wondered if either of you could sort of elaborate more, expand upon this bottom-up approach that basically arrives at the right principles through an open process of consulting stakeholders.
I can start. So that reminds me of parts of the book written by Wendell and Alan in 2010 called Moral Machines. So in the book, the authors actually talk about the top-down versus bottom-up approach extensively and touch upon the pros and cons of the 2 different approaches. And one of the drawbacks, if you will, of the bottom-up approach is that it needs a lot of data. And not only that, what if you have a mass of people who or a data of any sort that leads your program to be taught in a particular way that's not desirable at the end of the day? Right, because a lot of people may want to not get speeding tickets and still speed in highways and stuff like that. And if that's the kind of input that we have in teaching our systems, then, well, the robot might think that that's the right thing to do. Let's speed. And that's not the kind of system that we would ultimately consider as safe or legal in many sense of that. So the book actually approaches it and says that, when you consider that, you do need some input from top down as well. But I think when you have these interdisciplinary people or stakeholders coming together to talk about these things, then we already have a moral system in us, in how we think. So I think part of that could be naturally moderated in that sense. That's a hypothesis, not a proven fact, but.
Okay. Ergun, did you want to add anything on your thoughts on that?
Yeah, on top of that, we're not really saying that this is the approach to solve these kind of problems. But when we look at the literature, we see basically a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. What we did is we kind of combined both of them. So we collected the data from using a bottom-up approach, but at the same time, we generated the actions. So we didn't ask them to generate the actions, but we are thinking about letting the users to come up with their actions and integrating them both. But yeah, as you said, this has lots of technical challenges and that we need to overcome.
Great. Well, so we're up and running for sure. We've got this started, and I love the energy in especially talking with roboticists who are actually building these things rather than just some of us who sort of pontificate about law and values and things like that. And before we get into your paper, Aneta, I want to bring you into the discussion now and just have your reflections on this kind of approach, which has a bottom-up based element, because your own approach will, of course, come from the other way. So I'm just wondering if you have any reflections before we get into your paper on this.
Yes, I do. In fact, yes, I did my homework. I read the paper, and I think it's great, and the approach that you have taken. It's something that I think is missing with relation to the discussion that I'm involved with about privacy and security and how design and development of a product. What I'm curious about is that, and maybe you will be able to answer my question, like how you're gathering the data and what types of data you need in order to product development.
Yeah, actually, in the paper itself, we actually talk about some of the limitations quite a lot, because the pilot survey that we conducted in our project that we demonstrated to you, it uses a very limited type of a survey tool. As Ergun mentioned, it's limited to the 4 type of actions, and then on one of them is a dialogue, which was just my selfish point of view, my interest in human-robot interaction, because I'm interested in humans and robot communicating and dialoguing. Anyways, if we were to develop a web space that allows more qualitative discussions to take place and have an analysis on top of that, so there's like grounded theory principles that we can apply to code certain sentences, reasons why people would choose particular actions over the other, then we can have a rich set of data that can really inform our design of the human values at play in particular situations. So the type of data would come actually from the stakeholder discussions.
Mm-hmm, sure. Yeah, thanks for that answer. I asked this question mainly because we have ongoing discussion about big data, data analytics, and value of data. And somehow I'm thinking like, how this discussion about how we are designing our data protection laws and regulations, how that could impact the things that you're doing, or if there are any challenges that you may face with that regard. And I think that would be a pity if we wouldn't be able to go because of those obstacles that are coming up from the data protection laws. Yeah, so I think, it's extremely important, this bottom-up approach that is kind of missing currently in the discussion about privacy and security. And I see because I'm also involved and I'm working with certain organizations, and I see that there is not enough discussion about, and there's not enough involvement of different stakeholders, different interests within that process of product development, so that we can understand each other's expectations, interests, threats that we are seeing in that particular technology. So yes, coming back to my paper maybe. First of all, I just wanted to make a statement, since I'm probably one of the very few Europeans here. And I know that Europeans are perceived, especially in terms of discussion about privacy and security, in a very certain way. So I just wanted to assure you that I'm coming in peace and love. And by no means, I know we are all different. We have different approaches, but I think we all aim at, achieving the same goal, enhancing privacy and security, and achieving also consumers' trust when using our products, when using our services. So yes, having said that, my role is to sort of find as many bridges as possible between the EU and the US, and inform both the EU and US policymakers about the problems, about the differences that I think sometimes are causing lots of obstacles. That the problem is that we don't really understand the differences, historical, economical, social differences between us, and that is why maybe the discussion sometimes is not very easy, and we cannot really achieve, consensus. And that is why I also wrote this paper. I wanted to compare the EU and US approach and towards privacy by design and products liability, because I think that these are the two concepts that we are absolutely in line with, and we have more in common that we didn't even have before. And it's also very important in terms of robotics. If we look at the privacy by design as a safety standard, and with relation to products liability, I think it's extremely important, because robots, as any other IT technology, applies to products liability, given the fact that we have a tangible product. And even though we separate sometimes hardware from software, it still should be treated as one. And any injury that comes with the usage of that robot, it can be recovered by the consumer liability. So let me maybe start with the privacy by design and the approach, and the approach that I have taken is that I compared primarily the EU and US approach, but I also looked at the Canadians, since it's the birthplace of privacy by design. And the conclusion that I drew from that analysis is that the way privacy by design has developed throughout the years has changed a lot. And at the beginning, we looked at privacy by design as strictly embedding privacy into the design of a product. Now it has evolved, and it's not only about taking any particular technical solutions, but also looking at the whole data life cycle and the information management, which brings us to the point that I think sometimes we are having, policymakers are sometimes inconsistent, and if you look at the development of privacy by design, I think we are losing, and this boundaries has kind of blurred. And I'm not sure if we are already only talking about privacy by design, or it's already an accountability or data governance that it has developed so much, this concept. I think privacy by design is extremely important because it shows us that when we are putting product in the on the market, instead of addressing challenges that are coming the moment it's on the market, like for example when it happened with the Google Glass, there was great excitement about the product, but then certain policymakers or non-governmental consumer organizations raised their voices that this certain product may bring us, certain privacy and security challenges. Whereas I think the privacy by design, if it was applied properly, it could already address those challenges at the moment of the product development. Minimize that. In terms of products liability, the way and the reason why I looked at products liability, first of all, I think it could be a great alternative solution for the enforcement of privacy as opposed to focusing on the towards causes of actions or negligence. For a number of reasons. First of all, it's based on the risk-based approach instead of a harm-based approach, and we avoid having this challenge of proving manufacturer's fault. Another thing is that, and it was already mentioned at the beginning of, at the very first session today, also the foreseeable risks. This is a great concept that may help us to address all those challenges at the very beginning when we are developing the product, when we look at possible risks that the product may cause. Another thing is that products liability, on the contrary to other causes of actions, looks also at the bystanders. It's very important because usually bystanders that are not covered by the other either torts or negligence, if they are injured, they cannot recover the injury. Whereas under products liability, because they didn't really have any choice, or they didn't have any possibility to mitigate the risks that came with the product, they can in fact sue the manufacturer for any injury that they have suffered. Another thing that is quite important about products liability that makes it much better than the other options that consumers are having is that it looks also at the conduct of the consumers itself. And I don't know how about you, but sometimes I'm feeling kind of offended by the discussion on privacy and security and the way policymakers are thinking about consumers as, uneducated, illiterate people that, are not able to make decisions, and they don't understand anything, and they have absolutely zero knowledge. Whereas products liability looks at the consumer's conduct, and if the court or sees that the consumer had assumption of risks and it had a chance to mitigate those risks, but instead took a different path and was injured, maybe the company will not be exempted from the liability, but the liability itself, like the damages, will be lowered down. So I think this is also great thing that, yeah, we're not trying to protect consumers from themselves, but we're trying to engage consumers and show them that, we're giving you the best product we had, but, we need your cooperation as well, and you have to help us. Like when we are sending you an information that please, update your security software, please do so, and don't ignore that message because, if something goes wrong, you're partially also responsible for that. So yes, I think this is.
Okay, well, I want to pick up on a few of those things. First of all, I take it from what you said now and also from your paper that one of the contributions you'd like to see to make in this space is to try to have us reimagine the approaches that we might take to design flaws by understanding privacy by design principles as a kind of safety standard, and then that would set a certain threshold for how one would approach products liability law, such, if I understand it correctly, so that if a product, if a robot fell below a certain standard in terms of the way that they were implementing their design around privacy, that products liability law could be used as a means of redress.
Sure.
Yeah, that's the point. So one of the things that's sort of interesting to see here is, I mean, originally when I saw the abstract of this paper, both when you submitted it and also with the completed paper, I was excited to hear what I thought was in part going to be some lessons that we can learn from privacy by design in terms of how we might think about inculcating values into how robots are being built, and that these two papers would automatically and magically connect in a certain way. But although that didn't happen exactly, I think the way that I want to sort of conceptualize it for now, and see if you would agree with this, is that you're offering a different kind of design principle. It's actually a reconstruct of legal design, the legal architecture, so as to find a way within products liability law to see a failure to meet privacy by design standards as a means of redress. So it's more of a redesigning of the values through the legal architecture rather than through the robotic architecture. And so in that case, I think it's an interesting thing to do to sort of, in some senses, juxtapose some of what I think are either the conceptual commitments and maybe in some cases some of the value commitments in the different approaches that are adopted and taken in this process. So, for example, and I'll come back to AJung and Ergun, I would say that what we were just talking about, what I just described in my recap of Aneta's paper, is that yours takes an approach which is wildly different. I mean, yours takes an approach which argues that people perceive, at least in some instances, the ones you're interested in, the robots you're interested in building, perceive those robots as being different from other consumer electronic devices. They're not just products in a marketplace. They're not products at all. In fact, you know, relying on Kahn and others, you want to see them as in a different ontological category, perhaps, and that there's something more akin to a social actor, and that we should treat them as such rather than as products, because if we don't do that in those cases, we'll get the design features wrong and we'll get the values wrong. Is that fair, and can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so slightly different from how you phrase it, but I think people can't help but treat robots a little bit differently than they do laundry machines. And Kate can tell you more about that from her videos and stuff like that. But and in that sense, if we're in essence designing a new species out in the world, just like how we treat our pet dogs differently than our you know, if you interact with a lion in Africa, I think we'll have a certain type of interaction that becomes a norm that we are comfortable with, depending on the type of robots that are out there, types of things that we do. And I think the type of interactions that we would like to have with certain types of robots would have to come from bottom-up approach. And I guess privacy by design, to link Aneta's work a little bit, I guess depending on where the robots are being used, different application areas, people might have different reactions on what should be the norm, what should be the certain type of standards for privacy. And that could inform our design as well, and that could be related to how, or it can help you out as well.
Okay. Anything else from your team? And I don't know if Mike wants to jump in at some point as well. Feel free if you do. But anything else from your team on that point?
So I guess, so always when we think about these different values and behaviors and all these different implications on society, we always try to converge to one single point. Okay, so the robot should ride the elevator, should engage in a dialogue first before doing anything else. But that, well, to me, that kind of standardized the robots. Like, we only create one certain type of robots, but I'm just checking the Twitter, and someone wrote, robots can be jerks. So maybe I believe they should. So we have to see different kinds of robots. We have to see funny robots. We have to see more serious robots if it's a really task-dependent thing. But in order to get to that kind of different applications, we need to reach the different people instead of one single.
Mike, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. So thanks for presenting both of those papers. I was struck actually between an interesting interaction between what you presented and what George Carno said this morning, which I hadn't heard before, and that is that lawyers don't actually like to write new laws. That kind of was counterintuitive. We like to write new software and build new robots. So that's a bit different. But what I actually took away from that is that lawyers understandably, they like to stick within precedent. They like to stick within frameworks that have already been worked out through maybe hundreds of years of practice. And in the way what we are positing with Ori is that the behaviors that our robots that do have this bottom-up approach will exhibit actually are, in fact, they come from existing human behavior and human expression of behavior through their actions. So it might actually be easier, if you will, on the legal profession because it's all going to be somewhat of an interpolation of existing practice. So that was, I sort of found that interesting sort of resonance between the two. So it was just a thought on my part. And then another thing is that I've written papers on safety and safety by design and things like that. So I like the framework that you presented, Aneta. And the other thing that occurred to me is that after many, many years of observing or humans having values, I mean, what do? We create laws. We create let's say, behaviors that are socially acceptable. And in professional settings, we also create regulations and standards. So to some extent, the values that we hold actually end up as being safety or privacy by design. We, as professional communities, have designed that through sort of a low-pass filter through many years and many generations of technologies and so forth. So I think, for fast-moving technologies like robotics, we may really need to explicitly say we need the bottom-up approach to be able to generate the knowledge for us to be able to even create laws and to create regulations and to create standards. So to some extent, they're both bottom-up. They both come out of us. They come out of who we are as societies and disparate cultures and so forth. So I think there are different approaches at getting at a system that makes sense to most of us in the world. So I think it's all about human values, and do we start out with computational intelligence as frameworks first, or do we start as legal frameworks first, or are they kind of being merged together? So I don't know if you have any comments on that, but those are some.
Well, I did want to make one, and I definitely want to get the audience involved as well. I'll just make a quick response, which is you sort of anticipated what I was going to do in terms of juxtaposing what Judge Carno talked about this morning against this. And it's certainly the case that a more typical legal methodology could be described as conservative in a particular way, namely that we start with what we have, and only in situations where there's so much disruption that as the philosopher Wittgenstein would have said, when the saddle begins to buck too much, that only in those situations do we start thinking about things like new ontological categories. And so it creates a really interesting difference, I think, at least to think about, which is, on the one case, law seems to want to continue. There are all sorts of reasons within law for which it would be advantaged to merely treat the robot as a product, whereas I think the developers of that robot wouldn't treat it in the same way. And so there's an interesting tension that I think comes up there. It's an interesting question to ask, though we don't have to answer it, as to whether or not we need to sort out the ontological status of these things before we can think about doing either roboethics or legal design in these kinds of things. I'm wondering what the audience thinks about that, or if the audience has any other things that they want to talk about in terms of thinking through some of these juxtapositions in trying to connect the dots between these fairly different approaches.
So historically, the law has not been a speedy actor in creating whole new ontologies and ways of thinking about law. And we're looking at a technology that's on an exponentially accelerating curve. Its rate of change is going to increase, and it's already too fast for the law to deal with, at least for legislatures to deal with. So how can we get to the solution you're looking for if that pace is going to just keep increasing?
Our goal is to accelerate our process, to actually, accelerate not only the discussion, but to inform regulators so that they could be accelerated as well as need be, and be informed of the pace of the technology and where we're going.
Sorry, we can accelerate regulators?
Well, I don't really know. Too many lawyers in the room, but at least getting the information or feedback from the stakeholders available for policymakers. Yeah.
Oh, by the way, just one little hint. If I'm in an elevator and it's going down, it stops at the floor and the door opens and someone there goes, "It's okay, I'll take the next one." I don't feel very good about it. So.
Thank you.
Isn't that what the Google car's doing when it's winking at me? Ryan.
So this is this fascinating set of projects, and I love the way that you brought these together, Ian, for us, because when we were looking at these two papers, it did seem like there was a synergy, but now I see actually there is a synergy, and the synergy is the dynamic juxtaposition, which is fascinating. So one thing, in support of sort of Aneta's worldview about the need to sort of have it come top down in a sense and have the laws. We can all get together and sing, kumbaya about what's the right thing to do. If someone pulls up in a wheelchair, do you cede the elevator to them, right? So like everybody you ask that question to, I hope would say, yeah, right. I mean, that's the right thing to do. And so we can sort of envision this sort of Habermasian world where we all get on the same page by asking each other ethical questions, and then we design that into robots, right? Or you could imagine some kind of Rawlsian veil where you don't know ex ante whether you are going to be the one who's not able to get on the elevator because this big robot is sort of like, I have an urgent message, you have 3 seconds to comply, right? And so, but as an actual matter, right? So we would basically be answering these questions not out of necessarily an ethical compunction, but out of a motivation and out of a reflection of how this is going to affect me. In other words, imagine a hospital that has robotic orderlies that just replaced all the other orderlies. By the way, this is just my friend and colleague. We talked about soccer, and now it's a robot. And you suddenly ask questions like, how would you like this to happen? If the robot has an urgent message, would you like it to cede the elevator to you? And human beings are rational at base, right, as they are ethical. Would they not just game the system? Would they not, you know what I mean? Or what are they, right? Or what are they, right? I just mean that we act in our self-interest, right? As much as we have a mental model of what. Yeah. So we're
boundedly rational, right?
We're boundedly, so within certain with all of our cognitive, biases and warts aside, we act in self-interest, right? So like, why would you believe that? In all instances, crowdsourcing ethics would yield ethics rather than just yielding like, I want to be able to get out of here on time today in the hospital, and I'm not going to let that stupid robot get in the elevator before me, even if he's got an urgent message. Do you see what I'm saying? So like, how do you square that circle,
Yeah, so I'll start. So that's a really interesting question because it brings me back to some of the discussions we've had with other ORIO members. And looking at the surveys, okay, so the elevator writing scenario is really like dumbed down scenario, very, very small and simple. Where's the ethics in this? And what if people game the system and all the other stuff? And what are the factors that should be at play? I think the important thing to note about this particular project is that we start to think about these scenarios, and then we learn something from it, such as this particular project taught me something about the fact that we're dealing with human-robot priority setting here. Who gets the right of way, and what are the conditions in which we should give the robots right of way and yield to it? And those are the kind of questions that I can't rationally come up with an answer as a rational human being. I think there will be many cases in which I would rather have the robot right of way than not, in certain cases we saw in the video. So I don't think I would be lying if I said that crowdsourcing would always yield the most ethical answer. And part of that goes back to Wallach and Allen's argument about top-down approach and the pros of that approach. But I think it gives a very good starting point to go off, and also to identify where are the differences in the ways that people think. So if you had a group of Koreans taking these elevator rating surveys and a group of Canadians taking the surveys, and somehow we see a bimodal distribution of how people think about these things, then maybe there is something about culture that we can learn about it, and that should be programmed into the robot. So maybe if you're shipping a robot to Korea, then maybe it should have a particular Korean cultural module installed on it versus Canadian module. And we won't really know that unless we have that sourcing mechanism in play.
And just before we go to your question, Kenneth, I say to Ryan, if you ask a Rawlsian question at a robo-ethics panel, you'll get a robo-Rawlsian response. And mine would be this in support of the position that was taken. I mean, later on, you know, you well know that Rawls sort of distanced himself from his earlier imaginings of the veil of ignorance by saying, you know, this isn't some sort of Kantian metaphysical position I'm adopting, it's actually a political one. So he went political, not metaphysical, and in so doing, one of the things that he sort of turned to was this notion of an overlapping consensus. And in many ways, I kind of saw that as what you were trying to do through your stakeholder consultation, was that for some of these values, it might be appropriate to build a consensus around this where these aren't, you know, sort of in accord with obvious ethical dictums or something like that.
So, Ryan, your question about the person who says, I just want to get out of here, and the robot has the urgent message sign and get lost, tin can, right? But isn't the real problem going to be one step back further than that, that I'm going to be saying, I'm in a hurry to get out of here. I see urgent message. I don't believe urgent message for a moment. I believe that you said urgent message just because you wanted your delivery first, and I don't believe the human programmer of that particular thing at this point. And so in a certain way, these questions are going to leak back to intent on the part of your reading of the intent of people back one step behind. Now, one way to address that is to wind up having some universal thing that's known and trusted by everybody, or not trusted at all. You simply know. You say urgent message, and you know that if it's not an urgent message, whoever actually did that will get fired, right? And you can do that, and it can be a little bit like the beach master at D-Day in World War II, right? The sort of one person who's able to control access to the beach, and no rank or anything else makes any difference. That person has got total authority to coordinate the entire system toward its efficient result no matter what. Now, what I find really fascinating about the videos as we watch them unfold was to think about them in relation to the autonomous car discussions yesterday. Because what they both introduce are apparently cooperative systems, but because they lack any kind of central authority commanding them, there is nothing to ensure on their own that they're going to reach the efficient result of the resources that they're dealing with. Roadways in one sense, access to the elevator in another sense. And at that point then, we're making an assumption that we can program autonomous creatures, human beings, robots, in competition with each other around the scarce resource in order to autonomously and by processes of essentially selection and competition reach the efficient result. And I think that's going to open it to strategic gaming in all sorts of ways that we haven't considered, in the way that we saw with autonomous cars yesterday. Strategic gaming about, how aggressive do you have to be when the humans wind up sort of up-aggressing you? Do you respond? And here, then the question will wind up being the same thing. So there's a way in which one can look at this as being an ethical problem, but it seems to me that it's an ethical problem which is going to have to address the fact that it's one of the rare now but perhaps growing scenarios in which it will be competitive strategic behavior between humans and robots.
I was going to ask what the question was.
Can't these see how short I am so it automatically comes down? I love your work. I think it's very, very important and innovative, and congratulations for doing this and for being at the starting point. And as you know, I'm not an engineer, though I would love to be the psychiatrist for your robot, PR2. But it is all about expectations. So I felt when I saw the elevator scenario, and I know I do appreciate how much work goes into, the development and to the programming, but I felt like I had, before I saw the video, that I had information that a elevator rider wouldn't have, and that the robot never told me that it had to ride alone. So I'm wondering, as you go forward, if the importance of, we can't maybe control every scenario. Someone wants to take the sign that says urgent and trick their friend and say, not urgent. But I'm wondering if the robot should at all times try to convey its objective or its state of being. So no one ever knew that it had to ride alone. Unless you're in a closed hospital environment and it only rides a service elevator and everyone's been trained in the hospital to know that. So I just wanted to add that to if it applies at all to your future of, in preparing for expectations, that we give as much as we can about the state and the objectives of the robot. And then, of course, the communication can be a bit difficult. So what if I'm sick in an elevator and I'm vomiting? So I can't talk to it. I can't certainly read, but, it opens up and I'm on the floor vomiting, and that, would it be able to see me? Would it know that vomit or blood, should be an alarm? Or, anyways, those are just things to think about. And then lastly is, I'm wondering if companies that have already done some research on the socially acceptable behaviors in practicality. For example, the helpmate robot that rode an elevator in the 80s, designed by Joseph Engelberger. And a lot of these, they have studies and real actual data. It could be a DEPS mobile robot, it could be the tug, it could be any robot that uses an elevator, and they may be able to help you with what they've learned, and it may not necessarily be open, or it may not be out there, but it may be available. And I don't know if that will help you for your, but anyways, very impressive work.
It can actually ride the elevator with other people, but we didn't want to, just because to prevent some damages. But as you said, we can always bring more new parameters to this equation. Like, there could be someone inside the elevator, something bad happened, and we have only limited amount of actions, and also we have limited amount of capabilities to detect the state of the person. So what we believe, when the technology increases and when we try to investigate different kind of scenarios, we'd be able to see more, overcome these kind of challenges in a better way than we do now. I don't know if that answers the question, but do you want to?
Yeah, I just want to make sure mention. I think Mike has something to say as well. Yeah. So one thing that you touched upon is the point about communication transparency. So you phrased it in terms of expectation, but I come from a human-robot interaction person, so it's more of a communication, and depending on what has been communicated to you by the robot, then you build a certain expectation around it, especially if you haven't interacted with a particular robot before, right? So I think designing the interaction itself, if we had feedback like the one that you gave today, then we could have more of a transparent communication design implemented on the PR2 and then demonstrate that. And those are the kind of feedback that we don't always get as designers. We go through different experiments and survey designs and user testing and focus groups to actually figure that out. And I think part of what Ori could be is accelerating that process so that we have more people involved in that design. And I do agree with you that the robot could say, I have an urgent mail and I can't ride the elevator with other people because of safety reasons. Can you actually step out? Mm-hmm.
Mike, did you want to say something?
Yeah, well, just a couple of things. First of all, to remind people that this is actually, it's a machine learning algorithm that was implemented. So it's not just a heuristic that we sort of dumped onto the top of the main control modes of the robot. So the whole goal is that we do actually have a system that does learn about, the consequences of particular actions, and assuming that it can sense those. So that was just a short comment. And the other thing is, I like the comment you made earlier about, the intentions of the tin can as a robot. And that's, for a robot, that's very hurtful. But so this comes back to an earlier conversation we had about, is a robot is it actually an entity that has some autonomy and some agency and all that, or is it actually the model of the agent, or you brought that up earlier? And so should we be talking about the intentions of the robot, or in fact the intentions of the principal who owns the robot who has this urgent mail? So we shouldn't be considering it a tin can, because it's essentially the same thing as calling the president of your company a tin can, which probably would put you out on the street pretty fast. So there are these issues of values, and are they the robot's values? And so this may come back into, this has to become a separate ontological category, because we don't know how to deal with this. We don't know whose values to install or to embed on this thing. And it's, I've brought this up in conversation. It's the same thing between a landline and a cell phone. They do basically the same function, but we've developed an entire behavior set that is completely different between the two. So I think we are getting to that point where we are sort of slowly shuffling our way into the future and finding out how the capabilities of these robots actually map onto what we want them to do, where that's a sort of a shifting landscape or shifting sands. So that's all I wanted to say. Yeah.
If I could just say something alongside of that really quickly, is that, one of the things that I think the lawyers will have to think about very carefully is what happens when we get to a point, and isn't it a realistic thing to think that we will hit certain pressure points where to conceive of this thing as a product or a mere product in the sense of other products in the context of product liability is as much of a fiction as to think of it as a full-blown person or entity. That it is, and I think that's what Khan's work is trying to do, is to recognize that it somehow is being treated as though it's some kind of intermediate category ontologically. And what's important to remember in that, and the law recognizes this all too well, is that sometimes the perception of what a being is matters as much as what the being actually is. We always say that about, it's just as important that justice be perceived as having been done as justice having been done. Perception matters in law, and yet when it comes to these kinds of things, so far, a lot of the thinking that I've heard from the lawyers who are interested in solving or resolving some of these interesting problems about interesting robots are ones where we're sort of maybe afraid a little bit of developing new categories, but risking a hardening of the categories in ways that will actually undermine what those categories were originally set out to do. Seems like we've reached a stasis here, Ryan.
We can keep the conversation going, or we can take a little break. And it's been 2 days of robots in the law. We do have one last panel today that's basically on, it's a conversation between myself and Peter and Can about sort of lessons learned from the military context, and that's going to close out the day. But I don't want to. I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to talk, and recharge and talk outside and everything else. But are there other questions, other comments?
Can I
Yeah, please.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it would be criminal of me if I didn't mention that the project itself was done by 8 individuals that are the authors of the paper, including Camilla and Fausto over in Italy, and. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because we would like to have more collaboration with open source developers out there, as well as lawyers and other stakeholders who would like to participate and have a say in what we design next. So we do have a website set up, kind of. It's www.openroboethics.org. It's slightly under construction right now, but there's a contact form and everything. So if you have any feedback from watching the demo or our discussion today that you'd like to address, then please do contact us.
Could you spell that one more time? Because I'm not sure I caught it.
It's www.openroboethics.org, and I can tweet that afterwards as well.
Great. Yeah. Well, good.
Great. Well, with that, then, I'd like to thank all of our panelists. And Aneta, I think, in a sense, you were stuck in the position of being yet another legal voice in the sense that we've talked a lot about the law today. And if nothing else, one of the things that comes out of this for me is how important a conference of this sort is to involve the roboticists as well as the lawyers. And what I'd love to see evolve from this is to see more points of contact and connection rather than juxtaposition and distinction. But thank you to all of our panelists.
Yeah, thank you.